Welcome to this episode of Criminology Chats. I'm your host, JR, and I have two co-hosts today, Ashley and Miranda. Both have been on previous episodes of our show, and I am so glad that they decided to come on this show together.
Yes. Hi, JR. Hi, Miranda. I'm super excited to be here today and listen to our guest, Dr. Brady.
Hello, JR. Hello, Ashley. I'm excited to be here today, too, and hear about intimate partner violence.
And we want to provide our listeners with a trigger warning because we are going to be talking about intimate partner violence, both in adults and in children. So listener discretion is advised for this episode. What is IPV? I want to give a quick definition. This is the standard definition you can find online. It's a pattern of controlling and abusive behavior for a current or former partner, aiming to establish power through physical, sexual, emotional, or economic abuse, stalking, or threats impacting anyone in any relationship that disproportionately affecting women, though, and can lead to severe physical and mental health issues. It's a form of domestic violence that includes hitting, forcing unwanted sex, constant criticism, controlling, finances, isolating someone from friends, or stalking.
Yeah, so today in this podcast, we will discuss intimate partner violence with Dr. Brady. We'll talk to him about children that experience or they are exposed to IPV. We talk about adults and how they are affected by it and how that exposure impacts them and their future and later on in life with their relationships and whatnot.
Dr. Brady is a professional we'll be speaking to today. He received his PhD in criminal justice and criminology from the Sam Houston State University in 2017. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Colorado Springs. He has expertise in a variety of criminological areas, including intimate partner violence. His research focuses on how officers and prosecutors can corroborate evidence beyond physical injuries in domestic violence complaints. Welcome to the show, Dr. Brady.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here and talk to us about intimate partner violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Patrick. Nice to meet you. So the basics of IPV, I was doing a little bit of like a broad research on it, and I kind of noticed that like more of the common demographic, younger adults, women, but also I didn't really see much research about like does like ethnicity or any like specific racial groups, are they more predisposed, I guess you could say, than others? Or is it just kind of like what would you say is like the most common demographic for IPV?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so really what we know about intimate partner violence and domestic violence is that it really doesn't, I mean, it can impact any race, socioeconomic status. You know, we've seen cases where, you know, people that live in million-dollar mansions have, you know, committed strangulation or murdered their spouses, all the way to, you know, people who are unhoused and things like that. So the best research that we really have comes from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And so that's a nationally representative survey looking at different aspects of intimate partner violence, from the physical to the psychological to the sexual. And so what they found is that generally there are much higher rates among generally people of color, usually Black women, but the highest is going to be our indigenous populations. Across all severe types of IPV, it is generally much more prevalent in indigenous communities. But the main issue with that is that a lot of these surveys are weighted because it's a hard population to survey and to get information from. And so because it's such a smaller population, that's why those estimates are weighted. But when we weight them, it definitely shows that the indigenous, generally people of color, experience much higher rates. It is usually women tend to be the primary victim of intimate partner violence and even severe intimate partner violence. But what we are starting to see trends in what we call a gender parity in IPV. And so where we are seeing that women and men they're almost experiencing equal rates of perpetration from an intimate partner. But what some of my research is starting to see is that we are definitely overlooking a lot of women on women intimate partner violence. So I just submitted a study looking at strangulation and intimate partner violence and who's at the greatest risk for experiencing strangulation from an intimate partner. And I was able to get both the victim and the offender gender. And what they found was actually same-sex couples experience strangulation at much higher rates than women who've only been with male partners. and that was specifically true for women who have only had relationships with women. So with that, we start to see that there are a lot of different cultural nuances that are important for police officers, advocates, and also prosecutors to build some of these stronger cases, because some of the power and control dynamics that show up in, the African American community might be completely different in the Hmong community or an indigenous population. Same thing with the dynamics of a same-sex relationship might be completely different than, the dynamics of a heterosexual relationship. And so I think the biggest takeaway is that we can't just look at IPV as this kind of like nebulous overview. We have to look at it through an intersectional lens, because that is really what's going to identify who's at the greatest risk. And so what we know like right now is that generally women tend to be primarily the target. It can be perpetrated by both men and women, but generally it is the people of color and the indigenous populations that experience IPV at much higher rates, and also throughout the life course, starting in early childhood and their exposure to it all the way through adulthood.
Was kind of surprised to hear that your study showed that it was a higher percentage of female and female partnerships that experienced a strangulation. I would have thought for sure it would have been the male-female type of partners that had that.
Oh, trust me, it's been driving me nuts, because it completely contradicts everything that we know about this crime. But what I argue in the paper is what we know about asphyxiation assaults, so strangulation, suffocation, waterboarding, things like that, pretty much almost always comes from police reports and medical records. And so we know as criminologists, that's only the people that are reporting or seeking help. And so this data actually comes from a general population. I got a market survey research company to get me a large sample of queer identifying individuals. So it was 70% queer identifying, 30% heterosexual. And I asked for the genders of their partners and was able to make dyads. And so this is what we found. So so women who have been in relationships with both men and women who identify as bisexual, they experience strangulation at the highest rates. So from the NISFIS, the National Intimate Partner Sexual Violence Survey, among bisexual women, that found that like 75% of their victimization was from a male partner. But what I found in this study is that it was women who have only been in relationships with women since age 16 experienced much more frequent episodes of being asphyxiated to the point that they couldn't breathe. And so what I'm arguing is that the reason why we generally think that because that was the argument, is what we know is like strangulation is very gendered, and that it is pretty much men are primarily the perpetrators of strangulation against their female partners. But all of that comes from medical records and police reports. So we don't really have good estimates from the general public. So what we're finding is that among the same-sex couples, those cases may not be coming to the attention of the police because of those different cultural dynamics and the history of policing in the queer community. So a lot of the same reasons why, people in the African American community don't always want to call the police, it can be very similar to some of these other marginalized populations. And so what I argue in it is that, yes, it is still a gendered crime and that women tend to primarily be the victims of asphyxiation assaults, but what we're seeing in terms of what comes to the attention of the police isn't always an accurate representation of this crime. And so if we are continuing to think that this is primarily a gender-based crime where it is a male perpetrator against a female victim, we may be overlooking, strangulation assaults in the same-sex couples when they do come to the attention of the police. And we know that strangulation is one of the strongest predictors of intimate partner homicide. And so if we are overlooking signs and symptoms of asphyxiation assaults in same-sex couples, those could be homicides waiting to happen that officers may overlook, not because they're not paying attention, but because maybe they're not getting that specific training. We're understanding the dynamics of two men or two women in a relationship who are actually getting to the point where they are strangling each other, or one is strangling the other.
Okay, that makes sense.
You mentioned a lot about women. Do you think that society sees men and masculinity affects statistics and how many men are actually reporting being abused?
Yes. Oh my gosh, you guys have great questions. Yes, across the board, we know generally who reports crime and when people and what resources are available to support victims of crime. And so generally people who report crime, like violent crime against an intimate partner, tend to be much more women are more likely to report. A lot of this is because when men are victims of crime, there is a lot of masculinity issues at play. My primary research interest is evidence collection in these felony level domestic violence cases. So how do we help prosecutors and officers build better stalking and strangulation cases? I've read through tons of case files and projects and things like that. And a lot of it is you have men that if they do report, they're saying things like, I don't think she's going to kill me, but I think that she's going to ruin my life. From what it tells us is that men and the general public generally deem domestic violence to be serious when it is a female victim and a male partner. There have been several experimental vignettes that have varied the sex of the perpetrator and victim, and then asked people to read these scenarios, and rank who's most at fault, what's the most serious. And they generally look at violence between two women as really not serious because women can't hurt men, and women can't hurt each other. But that is not true at all. And even when officers get on scene and it is two women, officers tend to kind of categorize everything. And so they'll start to look at who's the more masculine one? Who seems stronger? And those are not necessarily accurate indicators of power and control. Women tend to be the ones that come to our attention the most in terms of police and prosecutors, and it tends to be male abusers. And so a lot of times men don't think it's serious enough to get the police involved, or they just don't want to deal with being judged by the police. And I've definitely seen, because it's not every day that you get a male victim of domestic violence or severe domestic violence against a female partner. And then when officers do encounter these experiences, it's not the norm. And so they're going to rely on stereotypes unless they get advanced training in this, which they usually don't. The most training that officers get in domestic violence is in the academy. And so unless they're in a specialized unit or they're opting in to take additional training, it's really like what you get in the academy kind of thing. So with that, they're dealing with, masculinity issues. And when victims are reporting to police, really one of the strongest predictors of cooperation is how victims are interpreting the situation. And so if victims are disclosing something that is traumatizing or sensitive, and they get the indication that the officer doesn't care or the officer's judging them, they're going to not want to give a lot of information, not shut down. They're like, never mind, I don't want to do this and stuff. So there's a lot of masculinity issues at place, not only for the victim reporting it who is a male, but also how masculinity gets portrayed on situations that don't have to do with men at all. And then once, so say they do report and, that this person does need services and resources, we don't always have shelters for men. And sometimes we have women who have kids that are 13, 14, 15, 16. Some shelters are women only. If a survivor comes in and they have a male child, they won't allow the male in there, and so they'll have to put them up in a hotel. And then sometimes some communities have vouchers to support male victims by getting them into a hotel. But much of our victim services is really focused around primarily women who seek help. And so when men are actually seeking resources, and they could be gay men, they could just be men in general, they'll go to a domestic violence shelter and they immediately get treated as the perpetrator. And it raises concerns and people get very nervous. When I was in Georgia, I was doing a lot of research on protection orders. And there are differences between a no contact order and a civil protection order. So I was like, I'm just going to call an advocacy agency that does legal advocacy and ask them. But because I'm a male, I even describe myself as I'm a criminology professor and stuff like that. But they were very hesitant to give me information because I think they thought I was a perpetrator trying to figure out a way to get out of this protection order kind of thing. And it's I wasn't offended by it. But if I was someone in crisis that was actually trying to get help and they're treating me like I'm the perpetrator, you could see how that would discourage people from wanting to help in general. But a lot of times men don't perceive these situations to be as serious unless it starts to get to the point where they feel like this is going to escalate to the point that they're actually going to ruin my life. But in terms of it's rare that you see men that are actually physically scared of their female intimate partner, or they may be, but they're not comfortable sharing that with the police. And so that's why with the stalking aspect, one of the main elements of stalking is fear. And so the issue with that aspect of the law is that men aren't going to say that, well, no, I'm not scared from it. I don't think she's going to kill me, but I do think that she's going to say, I look at, CSAM material, child sexual abuse material, or, I'm abusing the kids, or I'm abusing her, all these things like that. And so that's when they start to get concerned. And so that's why the stalking element also has substantial emotional distress to account for people who may not say, no, I'm not fearful for my safety, but I am losing my mind. I quit my job. I'm drinking a lot more. I got a counselor and stuff like that. That's the substantial emotional distress aspect, which helps prosecutors kind of establish that. And so that's where we get a lot more of the justice for male victims, but that requires male victims to feel comfortable enough to report. And a lot of times they just don't think it is serious enough until it actually could potentially impact their personal and professional reputations.
Okay. Go right ahead, Ashley.
Well, so given that IPV is more, it looks like, or it sounds like it's a much harder crime to research and investigate to get actual accurate statistics just due to kind of fear and retaliation, social constructs and whatnot. While I was kind of doing my research, I did notice that a common method of IPV was actually psychological abuse. So how would that go about? Does that kind of play a role in in actually believing the victims when they go to report it and like police interaction?
Yes. So what's interesting is, I do a lot of work with police departments. And so earlier this year, I actually moved to Washington State for a month and a half to look at how officers were implementing their lethality assessment protocol. And so a lethality assessment protocol is basically when you respond to a call and the involved parties are intimate partners. So they either share a child or their current or former dating spouses. Officers in this agency were required to administer a lethality assessment. It is an 11-item screener, and if they score a certain score, they are identified as high risk. From that's when officers convey their concern for their safety and try to connect them to an advocate on scene immediately. So I was able to go on ride-alongs every day, and they signed me an officer that tried to get me to as many IPV calls as possible so that I could see how officers were implementing this. And so in this particular state, it is also a mandatory arrest state, but the law is really specific to physical violence and protection order violations. And so you hear officers a lot of the times, like the victims are saying like, he's terrorizing me, he's trying to get me fired from my job and stuff like that. And officers are like, okay, but like, was anything physical? Did anything physical happen? And so I get it because that is kind of the elements of the mandatory arrest. So if they have probable cause that there was a physical, incident or there's a violation of a protection order, officers do not have discretion. They have to make an arrest in that situation. So officers tend to get trained a lot on focusing on visible injuries. And if visible injuries aren't there, then it's not a domestic. And that is not the situation. And so much of what we are trying to do is to get officers to ask questions that are going to elicit more information that relates to that psychological abuse. Because when we look at the studies of like severe intimate partner violence or even homicide, like it's really not a past history of physical violence that is the strongest predictor. The strongest predictor is power and control. And it's this concept that we call coercive control. And so this is where a victim feels like they are in a state, they almost describe it as like living in a prison without bars. Every single decision that they make, they have to second guess, like, is this going to piss this person off? Or everything revolves around keeping them and their children safe. And so they have to limit their discretion and their autonomy because everything that they do is going to piss this person off. And so this person has condition them to believe that if they disagree with them or if they don't do what they say, then harm is going to happen, whether it's to them or to their kids. And so that is a psychological state that we are not always assessing. And so you could have a victim that is experiencing coercive control that presents to you with literally no injuries. In some of these cases, they are using strangulation early on, and it's such a terrifying experience that they're like, this guy already tried to kill me once, so I'm just going to do what he says because I don't want to risk that again. And that includes talking to the police or cooperating with the case moving forward. That's why you have a lot of victims that are like, no, everything's fine. No, nothing's going on. There was just an argument, but everything's good. We don't, you guys can leave. You don't need to be here and stuff like that. And so it's that psychological aspect that is something that abusers instill kind of throughout the relationship. Like a lot of things that we think about is like, why would anybody stay with someone that hurts them or treats them like crap? But it's like, when you first meet that partner, like that's not how it is, right? Like everything seems great and it's fun for the 6 months because you're pretending to be these fake versions of yourself. And then, it's not until you start to see the cracks come through of like, this person could be a little bit controlling, but it's not going to be overly aggressive at once. It's a slow kind of gradual process. And so by the time that victims actually realize that they're in trouble, they're already too far into the relationship. And so by this time, they may have kids, they be married, they may have a lot of these, they may have adopted a dog together. So there's a lot of things that are keeping them together, and it makes it impossible for them to get out. And so when an incident happens and the police get called, and sometimes the police are showing up and it's not the victim or the perpetrator that called, it's the neighbors. And so you show up and the victims do not want you there because they know what's going to happen, because it doesn't matter if the victim is telling them, I didn't call the police. The perpetrator is thinking that she's the one that called the police, kind of thing. So when officers show up, they're looking for visible injuries. If they're not seeing visible injuries, then they're not taking it as seriously. And so, granted, in that state, it was a mandatory arrest, so that's why they were asking for visible injuries. But I've been doing this work for 15 years and going on ride-alongs and seeing officers really, really focus on the visible injury aspect of it without asking about these other things like, how are they using technology? Like, do you have access to the phone account? So if you had to leave the relationship, like, could you get off the phone record? Like, do you own the phone? Do you ever feel like they're, monitoring everything? Are you able to make decisions without a fear of a consequence? And that is not always what officers are asking about, because that's not really what they're trained in. And a lot of times, the psychological abuse seems like drama to officers. And so they're not concerned about, what's been going on the past 2 weeks. They want to know why they're here now. And it's not because they don't care. Sometimes it's because like they have a million calls going on. And some of these cases can take an hour to 2 hours to investigate. And they are very frustrating. I mean, I'm very passionate about improving police and prosecutor response to this. And there's times on calls where I'm like, I'm with the officers. This sucks. Like everyone is just not people that should be together, and they are nuisances to society and stuff like that. And it's not a situation where you're like, I'm absolutely terrified for this victim. It's like, no, these are frequent flyers. Like, we're dealing with these same people over and over again. They're high on meth. Like, they're breaking into homes. They're getting into fights in this hotel parking lot kind of thing. So it's like, these calls are not fun to respond to for anybody involved. And so I could see officers, getting frustrated and not wanting to know a lot of this drama and stuff like that. But from our perspective, and what we try to train officers to do is like, no, try to get as much of that information as possible, because if you are starting to pick up on power imbalances, that's going to help you identify what we call the predominant aggressor. It's not always about who hit first. It's about who has more power and control in this relationship and who's really in need of help the most. And the person that is not in need of help the most is likely that predominant aggressor. We're trying to identify the bully. And so a lot of that is that psychological aspect. But because that's not visible or something tangible that we can always see, officers only have a certain amount of time on scene with these individuals. And so we're expecting them to get this whole relationship history within, 30, 45 minutes kind of thing before they have to move on to the next call. So a lot of times they're just focusing on do I have evidence for a crime that happened? If not, it's considered a verbal and we're leaving. And so that was a lot of the calls. They were categorized as verbals, meaning that there was not probable cause for a crime. But I was telling the detectives, being like, but those are also really important to still write incident reports about, because the verbal could have been about a very important argument that could potentially escalate to a more serious crime later on. And so we need to be getting officers to take that information in, to document, as thorough as possible, even if they don't feel like that information is relevant, to make it easier for the next person that is going to review that case when we do have a very serious incident, to see if we can start developing a paper trail of figuring out where this victim fell through the cracks and how can we better prevent this so this doesn't happen. And a lot of that is paying attention to those verbals and seeing how we can provide them with resources to kind of, identify high-risk victims, get them connected to victim advocates to provide them additional level of support to help them kind of undo some of the brainwashing that a lot of abusers do.
Yeah. And I want to throw something into, I was a criminal investigator with the military for 20 years. And that's and that's a certain demographic. And what we saw there in domestic situations is, and especially when the Brady law came out, about domestic violence and maintaining access to firearms and everything. In the military, you have to carry a firearm. That's just the way it is. And if they got reported for domestic violence and the military member, be it male or female, couldn't carry a firearm, then they were discharged from the military.
Yeah.
And then there goes benefits. And what we saw a lot of times, and predominantly I'm older, so when I was in, it was more male versus male aggressors on the female victims. And what happened is everything was kind of free in the military. Medical, you had cheap food you could get at the commissary. And we had a phrase, and this is probably a bad phrase to say, but it was like that was the other significant relationship person's meal ticket. And everything was kind of good to go if they tended to tolerate the abuse more because they didn't want to lose the benefits that they had being married to that military member. And it was very hard for us to get a victim, if you will, or someone to talk and say they were actually being, abused by this service member, because they knew that could cost them a lot of benefits, if you will, and cost their partner a lot of benefits. And they may have 16 years in the military and got 4 years to go and get a retirement. And so there's a lot of different things there. And I don't know how much research has been done in that area. And I don't even know how much information you would obtain from those folks just based on the atmosphere of the military in general.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the military is it's so different. And so what's great at UCCS, our cybercrime professor is a former JAG officer. And so I talked to him a lot about domestic violence in the military. And this last paper that I published was data that I collected here in Colorado Springs. And here in Colorado Springs, we have 5 military bases. So it is a very military heavy town. And you're exactly right. And it's the things where, again, we go back to the idea that no one signs up to be in an abusive relationship, right? And a lot of times abusers are showing their cards when you're already too far in. But we also know that the victims that we are dealing with on scene are completely different than the victims that we will be dealing with during the follow-up, right? And so we may be dealing with a victim on scene who is willing to cooperate, tell us all this information about what's going on, and then 2 days later, they're not answering any of our calls. They want the protection order dropped. They don't want any of this and stuff. And that's because like the emotions have died down, and victims start to think like and ruminate of like, is this serious enough to keep pursuing or things like that, or the abuser a lot of times is trying to manipulate them to drop the charges, and they're saying things like, you're going to ruin our kids' lives because I'm going to get kicked out of the military, I can't have a job, all this stuff like that. And then also like if they're both in the military, like that could also create a lot of issues. What's nice about the military is like they have a lot more ways of holding perpetrators accountable, like do court-martial and things like that. So it's easier to kind of hold them accountable for that. But one of the main issues with prosecuting domestic violence cases is that you need a witness. And oftentimes the witness is the victim. And so then you have a lot of issues with, privilege if they're married and things like that. But also it's, they are invested in these relationships. Like when you ask victims, like, what do you want in this relationship? It's like, I love this person. I just don't want to, I want him or her to stop hurting me kind of thing. So it's like they don't want to end this relationship. They love this person. They've developed a family together. They've invested their time and resources and energy into this and stuff. And so when the state is coming in and filing these charges, the victim recognizes like, oh, wow, this wouldn't have happened unless I reported kind of thing. And that's a lot of the abusers are putting that on the victim of like, this is your fault. You're ruining everything, because a lot of the abusers are not great people and they can't take accountability for themselves. And so they're going to blame the victim. And so then that's going to put more pressure on the victim to not say anything, to disclose. And then what that does is send a message to the cops is like, I hate these crimes because the victim never wants to cooperate and blah, 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 all this stuff like that. But now we're actually getting a ton of research to show that it's usually the abuser who is manipulating the victim into recanting. And that is the emotional aspect of that is one of the key factors. There's a fascinating study out of Washington. They analyzed jailhouse phone calls between men who were arrested for felony level domestic violence. And they analyzed all these jailhouse phone calls to figure out like, why were all these victims recanting? And they actually saw a very clear pattern. And it was really the emotional. So a lot of times the perpetrators would basically describe the conditions in the jail and how it's awful and how they're starting to think about suicide and they don't know if they can go on. And you hear it in the phone call of the victim being like, suicide? No, babe. And so like, that is like the key pinnacle is like the second that they can get empathy from the victim, then all of a sudden all these abusers turn into like legal experts. They know exactly what to do to drop the protection order and all this stuff like that. And they actually try to get the victim on their side and convince the victim that the advocate, the police, the prosecutor, they're trying to destroy our family. They're trying to do all this and this and this. And so some of the research that I do now is how do we use that information to actually hold abusers accountable? So one of the studies that I looked at was what are victims reporting to officers on scene immediately following them surviving a strangulation assault. And we saw so many like intent aspects of it. So in 25% of those cases out of Austin, the perpetrator said, I'm going to kill you while they were strangling them. And so at that point, I was like, why aren't these being investigated as attempted homicide, right? And so, but because a lot of it is about, it's not necessarily about wanting to kill the victim. It's wanting to let them know that they can and will kill the victim if they disagree with them. And so that's really important for officers to document and put into their reports, because if a perpetrator is now using, jailhouse phone calls to manipulate the victim into recanting, that's great information for a prosecutor for them to file what we call forfeiture by wrongdoing. And just real quick, so everyone has a Sixth Amendment right to confront anybody that is accusing them of a crime. So that's why a lot of these cases are hard to prosecute, because the victim doesn't want to testify against the person that they love. And so a lot of times victims will be unavailable to testify. They refuse to testify, or they just are ignoring subpoenas. It's very hard to find them. And so what happens is if prosecutors can prove that the reason why the victim is not willing to participate or testify is in part because of the defendant now waives their Sixth Amendment right to confront the perpetrator, because you don't get to make your witnesses disappear who are going to testify against you. This is actually based off of a polygamy case, bigamy. The guy had like multiple wives and he was being investigated by the feds in Utah. And so he was like, I'm just going to send 3 of my wives to different states. They can't testify against me. And the Supreme Court was like, no, you have a right to confront your witnesses and victims and things like that, but you don't get to make them disappear so they can't testify against you. And so that emotional, back to that psychological, the emotional abuse, that's why that's so important to document in those reports, so that when it gets to the prosecutor, prosecutors can pick up on like, oh no, this is a coercive controlling situation. This perpetrator is trying to manipulate the victim into not cooperating with us. And so we need to do as much as we can to develop these, what we call an evidence-based prosecution, where we we don't even really need the victim to testify because we have so much evidence to show that this person is engaging in a pattern of conduct that violates the law.
Got it.
You mentioned a lot about like the emotional part of it. Is the evolution from love bombing to the violence, is there a common timeline there? Or is it associated more with younger individuals, or is it just anybody?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. A couple different things. And so when I was going through grad school, I worked as a research assistant, and I got put over in the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. And it was an awesome job because they were the national technical advisors for teen dating violence. So anybody that was trying to implement teen dating violence prevention programming would call us and we would help them with that. And so I did a ton of work in schools trying to implement bystander intervention programming. And so working with youth into, how do you step in when you see an abusive situation, or how do you talk to a friend that's in an abusive relationship? And so we talk a lot about that, like what do, some of these behaviors look like? And the reason why it's important to talk to teens is because if you don't have healthy relationship education, like you're going to be learning that either from what you see in your home or what you see on the media. And the media does not model great, healthy relationships all the time. And so sometimes people are being love bombed and they think that, and it may be, their first relationship or it's a new relationship. And so they like that they're getting all this attention, and then it's nice because someone's paying attention to them. And so sometimes it's like, that's what the love bombing is. It's to get you to like them so that like when they start to make mistakes, you overlook those mistakes until it's too far into the relationship. So I haven't seen any like specific research that has actually estimated like how long it actually takes until like a physical violent incident happens in a relationship. But we do kind of see the cycle where it's a honeymoon phase, right? So they're trying to overwhelm the other person, like buying them stuff, like sending them flowers, making it seem like they're like the greatest person ever. And granted, like it seems kind of normal in relationships when you're trying to get to know people, but if it's the excessive aspect of it that should raise red flags, because if this person is being overly generous and just too almost like obsessed with this person, it's either unhealthy because it could be a potential stalking situation, or they're grooming the environment. So like when they actually make a mistake or when they actually hit the person, they've already manipulated this person into thinking that they're a great person, that, this was just a one-time thing because they were drinking. And so like, we worked through it. He says he's never going to do this again. And then you kind of have this like cycle. That's why they call it the cycle of abuse. Is you have this like kind of honeymoon phase, everything's great. Then it's kind of a tension building phase where the victim starts to realize, oh, I guess I can't disagree with him, or I can't say this, or I can't do this. I can't hang out with my friends because, she gets upset about it. And then there's a violent incident that happens. And then the victim's pissed, doesn't want anything to do with them. And then it's a love bombing all over again. I'm so sorry. I'm going to, I'll never do that again. This has never happened before. I love you. Send you all flowers and all that stuff. And so it's an emotional manipulation, because a lot of abusers are entitled, and they feel like if they're not comfortable in the relationship, they're going to make it uncomfortable for the other person until it's comfortable for them. So they're going to do anything and everything to kind of manipulate the victim into staying with them. Because if you think about like an abuser in a relationship, everything centers around him or her. So, we always ask like, well, why doesn't she leave? Why are we asking if she's leaving? Why isn't he leaving? He's the one that's mooching off her. He's the one that is hurting her, and they both own the home. So like he should be the one that leaves because he's the one that's committing the crimes, kind of thing. Yes. So not necessarily a timeline, but it's more of a cycle. And again, it's victims will, to a certain point, tend to overlook some types of abuse because they think more about the person that they met. And then it makes it more complicated when you have kids involved, when you own property together, when you're married. And so that's why things like people getting into relationships and then getting engaged and married really quickly, that's also a red flag, because it's like there shouldn't be a rush. And it's usually whenever I see like someone I also went to school in Utah, so it wasn't uncommon that people would get engaged within 6 months. But in my head as a criminologist, I'm like, they're going to murder each other for insurance. Like, that's what I'm thinking is
I totally agree. Yeah. As someone who lives like in Utah, and I've been here my whole life, it's something that and like you said, it's very socially, it kind of fluctuates with social and like society and culture and whatnot. So it for sure differs from like state to state. Here it's more normalized in Utah. But like you said, there's always red flags everywhere. There's underlying issues, regardless of religion and whatnot. It should be looked at equally.
Yeah. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually I saw a lot in Utah is sometimes religion is used as a power and control mechanism, especially in the Catholic religion, Mormon religion. Like divorce is really, especially in Utah, and like everything is image portrayal, among LDS and stuff. And so like you want to portray this like perfect life kind of thing.
Exactly.
And so when you're trying to portray this perfect life, what happens behind closed doors tends to not get talked about ever. And nobody wants to be known as a person that's divorced or, going against their faith. And so abusers will actually use that, like, this is what the Bible says, this is what the church wants. And so they won't go to like a counselor, they'll go to their bishop or their pastor. And sometimes, that's why there's a lot of outreach to educate religious leaders about power and control dynamics. But in some communities, like, you don't go to the police, you go to a community leader who's not trauma informed, who doesn't understand, the power dynamics. They understand kind of the culture of what men do in this community, what women do in this community. And so, divorce is not acceptable, so you guys got to work it out. And so sometimes victims are really invested in their faith and they don't want to go against God and they don't want to go against their partner. They made this commitment. And so sometimes abusers will use that to their advantage to trap, people in these relationships and really, really, soil their religious perspective to make it make sense to stay in this unhealthy relationship. And so there's a lot of things that these abusers can use to really keep people in these abusive relationships.
Exactly. And living in Utah, there's huge families and whatnot. So then you kind of switch the gears to how are the kids involved and how are they being affected? And obviously it's endless, but I just kind of want you to like touch base on like how poor children, they have nothing to do with this, but like how are they affected?
Such a great transition. So yes, and that's another thing too. And what's actually interesting, so I teach a lot of child abuse classes as well because I like to punish myself, just because I feel like it's so important. And there's so many aspects of child maltreatment that overlap with IPV. And what I try to convey in a lot of my trainings is like, if you're seeing, neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, you're also likely seeing intimate partner violence in the home as well. Like those overlap very well. A lot of these offenders are not what we call generalists. You don't have men that specialize in domestic violence. Most offenders in general are going to be called generalists. So, your domestic abusers, they're also getting DUIs. They're also getting into fights in bars. They're stealing from stores. Like they have other criminal records. Like when I was doing criminal records of stalkers love to get DUIs. Like it's just, they're just so obsessed with this person that it doesn't matter what state they're in, they're going to go find them kind of thing. So like what happens with the child maltreatment aspect of it, one of the key things we know is generally like the more kids in the family, the higher the risk of child abuse for tons of different reasons, stress, money. You have to remember all their names. It's a lot. But especially in Utah, where, you want to portray this perfect image. I mean, look at the Ruby Frankie case and everything like that. Like those kids were that's completely different because they were cast into this family YouTube channel and stuff like that. But it's one of those things where we start with like the child maltreatment because that's really important, because what's interesting is a lot of times like kids don't always, unless parents are educating their kids about good touch, bad touch, different things like that, you don't necessarily know. And so, a lot of times I have my students read a book where this young girl was being sexually abused by her dad, but she didn't realize what was going on until she was like 11 or 12. She knew that it was wrong, but once she started to talk to her friends and, her friends were being like, that's not okay kind of thing. It wasn't until she went to other people's homes and started hanging out with other people that she started to realize like, oh, wow, other people's families are way different than mine. Like no one's screaming, no one's throwing furniture. Like this is kind of interesting. And so that makes it great for an abuser because you can keep everything behind closed doors, because you can keep your kids home from school if they have any injuries or things like that. And sometimes kids they condition them that if you tell what happened between mom and dad, or if you say, what happened between mom and mom, like you're going to get punished. And so kids want to appease their guardians. And so sometimes they are conditioned to believe that that type of abuse is normal, and they just don't say anything because out of fear of not only for themselves, but a lot of kids and families are trying to protect the other siblings and things like that. On top of that, officers don't like talking to kids. They automatically assume like, oh, if I talk to a kid, I have to get him to a forensic interview. That is not the case. Actually, kids can provide a ton of information on these IPV calls because they know what's been going on. They're not dumb. I mean, so a lot of times parents think that like, oh, well, we don't fight in front of our kids. We go outside and all that stuff like that. Kids are very perceptive. So there's been several studies where they have taken like young infants and let them sleep in like an MRI or something that measures their brain waves. And they've made like just like kind of banging noises outside. And they still see that it impacts their brain waves and also their REM cycle. And so the takeaway from that is that even if you think that you're shouting outside or, kids, even when they're sleeping, can sense when there is tension, even when they're not cognizant of it. And the research shows it doesn't matter whether they are physically seeing the abuse happen or they're hearing it, as long as they're within earshot, that can still impact child development. So if there is a kid that is growing up in a home with a lot of intimate partner violence, it is basically conditioning that child to believe that this is how families are, this is how relationships are. So when that kid starts to get into relationships, they're going to start to be either very submissive to another person or to be very dominant and controlling. And, if this person disagrees with them, you hit them because that's what I learned from, my parents and things like that.
Exactly, because they're just like sponges and they just take everything they see and hear, and for them, they don't know what's right versus wrong, because that's what they're seeing.
And you don't want to get your parents in trouble. You love your parents and stuff. And so like, that's what's so like, even with forensic interviews, like I've seen forensic interviews where like the kids, you have a 14-year-old girl that's like, well, I don't really want to say anything. And it's like, well, tell me more about that. It's like, well, because I know what's going to happen, because my dad's going to get arrested and then my mom's going to become homeless, or like we're all going to become homeless. And this is just going to ruin my entire family. And I remember that specific case, my students asked the forensic interviewer, was like, well, what happened in that case? And she was like, literally everything that she said. Her dad got arrested and they end up homeless, and we try to help them and things like that. So sometimes kids are very perceptive and they are trying to protect their family, but then that also, it's a traumatic situation. And what happens is you basically are kids who grow up in very tumultuous environments, whether that is a dangerous community where there's a lot of gangs and gun violence, all the way to violence in the home. It basically shapes our body in ways that it creates what we call hyperactive stress response systems. So generally, victims who have experienced long forms of abuse from childhood all the way through adolescence to even emerging adulthood, it conditions their brain to respond to things that people who haven't experienced abuse would. So they are just much more hyperreactive. They're constantly operating in a survival mode. And when you are in a survival mode, it is very hard to thrive because you're constantly worried about your safety. And so you're constantly releasing a lot of these stress hormones, which impacts development over time. And so unless we are doing early intervention like therapy, healthy relationship education, but also just like social emotional learning, like teaching kids how to share, teaching kids how to deal with jealousy and conflict like early on, like those are the things that really kind of separate those that continue of a life cycle of abuse as victims, but they also start to become perpetrators as well. And so we know specifically with child sexual abuse, like that is one of the strongest predictors of victimization and perpetration in adulthood for intimate partner violence. And it's a lot of it is because it really messes up, the brain as a child is developing. And then so it's like 0 to 3 is when the brain develops the most. And so if there is a lot of chaos in that home, the brain is developing in a ways that is going to teach that kid to be constantly hypervigilant and survival. And so that's why when we have kids that are coming into school and they're getting kicked out of class because, they're disruptive, or they're getting into, fights and they get in-school suspension and things like that. Like generally those are the kids that have gnarly home lives, that they're constantly operating in chaos. And so when they come into school and they're expected to sit and listen and pay attention, like that's not comfortable for them. And so they're going to act up and create chaos. And then that feels much more normal to them. We see this a lot with parolees that are coming out of prison, is that like they've been sober for a while and, it makes them feel uncomfortable. And so if they're meth users for forever, like they feel more comfortable using the meth versus not using it. And so it's very similar for kids that have hyperactive stress response systems tend to act out a lot more because that is a normal feeling of chaos. And that's really not what kiddos should have to be experiencing.
You mentioned the amygdala and the fight or flight response, and it also affects anxiety and aggression. Can it increase bullying in school from the kids who experience abuse at home?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like one of our criminological facts is a victim offender overlap, and that there is a portion of people who are victims and offenders. And that is very common in the bullying aspect too, because, I used to work with juvenile sex offenders, and I also supervised rich adolescents in this boarding school. Something that they can get conditioned to in terms of how they deal interpersonally with others. And so sometimes you have kids that grow up in abusive households that they become the bully because they're modeling the behaviors that they're seeing. And so a lot of times when we're talking about like the predominant aggressor aspect of it is like when officers show up on scene, you have injuries on both parties and they're accusing each other. The next step is for officers to avoid a dual arrest because those won't be prosecutable. They have to identify who we call the predominant aggressor, who is essentially the bully. And so generally that's the person that is engaging in the abuse or the power and control. And so that goes back to childhood of them doing that to others. But then also it could be, they could be much more vulnerable because they live in an abusive household. And then that makes them much more vulnerable to like sex predators and stuff like that, because they see these kids that have a rough home life that they can groom and that they can abuse, because if anybody says anything, like no one's going to believe them anyway. That's why we see a lot of like teachers offending on students, because it's an easy way to target vulnerable individuals that don't have good social ties, that are not going to interfere with them trying to get whatever they want from this kid. And so it makes them both vulnerable as a victim and a perpetrator. And in some cases, they become both.
one of the things that I have seen, because I have been communicating with some people incarcerated individuals who are in jail for life without parole because of the people I've been communicating with committed murder, or they were part of a felony murder type of situation. And one is on death row right now, a female, and all of them had similar things in their background. Broken home, sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally abused. And it seems like that is the model and prescription, if you will, for them to do something violent themselves later in life.
You know exactly what you're talking about, because what you're talking about is correct. There's tons of longitudinal studies where they follow people, followed them with surveys and stuff like that. Not like they stalked them. But a lot of those are also retroactive surveys. So people who are abusers get surveyed, and then it shows that they have these very rough childhoods. But then we also have this whole volume of literature on ACEs. So adverse childhood experiences. Are y'all familiar with that?
Yeah.
So there's ACE scores. And so now a lot of agencies are actually incorporating those into their screeners. And so when you talk to social workers, they're constantly talking about what is our ACE score and stuff. And so these are all individual and household and community experiences 0 to 17 that are considered traumatic. And the more traumatic experiences that kids have, the more negative quality of life outcomes that they have. And so not only do they end up in our criminal justice system, but they also develop substance abuse issues, mental health issues. And so they're just on a trajectory that puts them at much higher risk for those type of delinquent and victimization types of risky behaviors. So what I want to clarify, though, is that just because someone was abused as a child does not mean that they are going to become a victim or they're going to become a perpetrator. And so a lot of what that divide is supportive environments, early intervention and education, and also the willpower among a lot of victims, and seeing that this happened to me, I would never want this to happen to anybody else. And so I'm going to make sure that this doesn't happen to anybody else. And so not only do we see a lot of people who are currently it's actually very rare to find people who are serving time in prison who do not have a traumatic background of any kind. And that may not necessarily be in childhood, but a lot of them, we know that a lot of people who are incarcerated tend to have parents who are incarcerated. Just like we have a lot of academics whose parents so happen to be academics, because it's also hereditary. One of our main theories of crime is low self-control, right? That's a super trait of, irritability, impulsivity, aggressiveness, and things like that. That is genetic. 50% of that comes from, the parents and stuff. So if you have a history of a parental incarceration, which is one of the adverse childhood experiences, it could be a pattern that is really hard to break, because people grow up in the environments. That's why we call it intergenerational trauma, is it gets passed down not only through genes, but also the environment as well. And so it's not surprising that we have so many offenders and people who are incarcerated who have these traumatic backgrounds. And my main soapbox is we need to be doing a lot more to address this unaddressed trauma in that population, so that we can actually get them the resources to get them out of the system, because a lot of what crime is impulsivity and survival. And so, if we can provide them the resources, to help with some of these things, potentially we can deter them from the system. But if you grow up in an abusive home, and then you're likely going to be much more of a juvenile delinquent. And we know that the second that you get locked up in the juvenile justice system, that's almost a strong predictor of getting involved in the adult system. So it's really one of those things where young people can get caught up in a cycle that was really the result of a tumultuous childhood. And it's just a cumulative disadvantage throughout the life course.
And that's one lady that was on death row in her trial. Now, this is, again, let me paraphrase this first with, this is her story, not what I read in the research, okay? But she says that, hey, back then, and this was in the early 2000s, the court system really didn't feel considered her upbringing and took that into account when sentencing her, okay? Now, granted, like you said, just because you have a bad childhood, that doesn't mean you're going to be a murderer. Okay. But she said that she was under the influence of this gentleman so much, that was her partner, that, she did whatever he wanted her to do, but he actually physically did the murders, but they also committed robbery from the presence. So she got convicted of the felony murder, not actually doing the act, but because of the robbery of the household and taking stuff. There you go, and that's felony murder now. And she came from a teacher abused her sexually. Her father abused her, stepfathers abused her, and things of that nature. And this is all documented. And actually, some of them admitted, yeah, I did that to her. So the problem is do you see that the court systems now, this is early 2000s, have you seen in the court systems that they look at this more, I guess, look at it more now when it comes to people's background or childhood traumas, when it comes to sentencing?
Yes, I think people working in our current system are getting much more education and training on being much more trauma informed. And we know specifically with pre-sentence investigations. So that's where they're actually sitting down with the offender and like going through a lot of that. So because they want to provide the judge with enough information to make a reasonable, rational decision, right? And so part of that is not only the aggravating factors of the crime, but also the mitigating factors. But the thing is that, you definitely have some, hard charging judges that are just kind of like, child abuse is not an excuse for murder. And it's not. Like, it is not like a justification. And that's not what they are doing. They are trying to provide an information of like, this person grew up in an environment that a lot of people didn't. And that's why this person ended up on this track. And when you look at how this person ended up with everyone else that's incarcerated and things like that, like they have very similar pathways to this. And so I think from early intervention, concentrating on ACE scores and stuff like that is becoming much more common to prevent them to get involved in the adult system or even the juvenile justice system. But sometimes it is like, yep, they hear this over and over and over again that they came from a bad home. And so sometimes judges are just like, that doesn't matter. Like, and so it's hard because I never want to sit here and be like, that's why we should justify murder. Like, that is not what we're saying at all. It's like taking that into consideration. But it's the same thing with like mental health issues as well. It's like, just because someone has mental health issues, obviously in their psychosis and they aren't in reality kind of thing. But if they have like depression or anxiety, like that doesn't justify robbery or anything like that. And so it is something to take into consideration as if like this person has a particularly hard life where they didn't really get a lot of chances and support. Like, locking them away for the rest of life like may not be the best option. And that's kind of where it's supposed to be. Where it becomes like a big issue is in family courts because they just think IPV and child abuse is just drama. The parties are making it up because they're going through a divorce, all that stuff like that. And so there's a big push now to really increase the training in family court judges to take child abuse and domestic violence seriously and really try not to rely on the people who are making it up to get back at the other person. And so because there's a lot more turmoil in the family court, they tend to minimize it and not take it as seriously. And then there are several judges that, like, unless there's physical violence, they don't consider it to be intimate partner violence. They don't consider the emotional aspects of it. The other thing that's important to understand is a lot of time with female offending, a lot of times there's a male partner that's also a co-defendant in those cases. And that goes back to the idea of like, if you have a rough childhood and then you have to go to school, but you're getting kicked out of school and you get put into the detention center, well, you're getting put into a detention center with everyone else that's getting kicked out of school because they have bad home life. So then you start hanging out with them because now you have access to, now you know who's selling all the drugs and you spend a lot of time with them. And so you know them from the inside. And so then you start hanging in with the outside. And so then you start to hang with the bad crowds because your parents don't care about you. They're not paying attention or the parents do care about you, but she's working 3 jobs. And so you have to do a lot on your own. So you have a lot of unsupervised time. And then you're going to be hanging out with these other people. And so sometimes people get locked up in the system because they're at the wrong place at the wrong time. But especially with, female defendants with male co-offenders, like a lot of times they are being manipulated by the other person because of a history of relationships being inappropriately modeled for them.
Exactly. I would like to talk very briefly. I know, and Miranda and Ashley, can you have more questions? Not a problem. We can go as long as we need to, but I wanted to talk about just college students for a moment because there's a lot of IPV, and I believe in college students, and especially what they talked about, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, maybe the red zone, which is like the first few months of a semester. And I'm talking more about a resident school where you're physically going to that school versus online. But can you speak a little bit to that and what you see in that involving with the college students and that red zone and things of that nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So the red zone is real, but I think we have to understand the context of college. So I taught a class on campus crime, and it was like kind of halfway through that class that I realized I'm like, oh wow, a lot of my undergrad students are just, they're children. They are kids still. Like they're not even 21 yet until they're a senior kind of thing. And that's kind of where college sets up this kind of perfect environment for vulnerability. And so we are now starting to see from a lot of the psychological research is that we almost have a new developmental period. So we have like childhood, adolescence, now we have this new developmental period called emerging adulthood. We now know like our brains don't fully develop until 25, generally 30 for men. As a result of the housing crisis and also COVID and things like that, we start to see a lot of millennials like living with their parents for longer times or going to college and now living with their homes. So it's almost like this extended adolescence where people don't really feel like they're an adult until like they have stable employment, they're married, or they have children. And people aren't doing that until 35. They're now doing it much later in life than the 1960s after, World War II and stuff like that. And so, and also millennials, like we're all screwed. So like we can't have kids, we can't own property, all that stuff like that. So it's more this extended adolescence. And so it's called this emerging adulthood. And my research shows like that is where the most vulnerable period is. And even when you look at like our National Crime Victimization Survey, 18 to 24, the highest rates for sexual assault, IPV, and a lot of these other crimes. And if you think about it, it's because it's a lot of times the first time people are on their own and independent, right? So you have an 18-year-old that's moving into the dorms. You have all this freedom in the world. You can stay out as late as you want. Nobody gets to tell you what to do. So then, especially if you were sheltered or you grew up in a party environment, you're going to continue that. And so you're going to engage in a lot of high-risk behaviors because that's what college students do, because college students experiment. And so we put ourselves in situations that we normally wouldn't. And like I always tell my students, it's like, think back of like one of the bad things that you did that you regret. Like I guarantee that you were probably with someone else, a peer, and they influenced you, or something you influenced each other kind of thing. And so that's what happens. And so you are a new person to this environment. So you're going to do things to kind of fit in so you can make friends. And sometimes you may not have a relationship history. So then you finally find someone in a class that seems great. And this may be your first relationship. And so that's where an unhealthy relationship could happen, because nobody's teaching people about how to have a healthy relationship. But the other aspect is like Greek life. I'm sorry, like that Greek life is a huge risk factor for sexual assault. And if you think about it, it is set up in that it makes it much easier to do. Because what's really interesting is like sororities, they're not allowed to have alcohol in the house, but the fraternities can. And the reason for that is because most people in college are not 21, so they can't go out to the bars. So they're going to go to these gross frat houses where they have to have a woman to get in, and women can drink free and stuff like that. And that's all to get them intoxicated so that they can take advantage of them. And that's not just the Greek frat bros that are taking advantage of women. It is other people that are at these frat parties that are, trying to wait until, women or men get to the point where they're completely sloshed and then taking advantage of them. And so because we don't ever talk about consent, because talking about sex or, consent in school is, so nobody understands what consent is until they watch that T video in their like intro to freshman class kind of thing. And so young people don't have the communication skills to talk about what they want, what they don't want. And if you are in this new environment, you're trying to fit in, you may do things that you wouldn't normally do. And that could be in terms of like sex, drugs, rock and roll, things like that. That's why we have actually a huge issue with consensual choking. There's a lot of research looking into choking like during sex. And the idea between that is if you limit oxygen supply to the brain, it's supposed to give you a much more euphoric effect. That's where if you've ever heard of like autoerotic asphyxiation, where people are hanging themselves and masturbating. I'm a real fun time at dinner parties.
They actually died. Yeah.
One of my first exposures to that was a medical examiner doing a talk on autoerotic asphyxiation, and he just had all these crime scene photos of like how they found. So it's like they're in lingerie. One guy was dressed as Batman, and he was like hanging up from the garage door, and his wife like opened the garage door and he was like hanging in there, and it was like an accident. And then she found out he was like really into Batman. So anyway, so it's like that. But like a lot of the college students don't know that, because what they see in porn is, this like choking and strangulation. So there's a lot of this like research that's coming out. People who have had a recent sexual encounter where choking has happened, like, tell me about how it happened. Like, did you guys talk about it? No one ever talks about it. A lot of times the men are the ones that are doing the choking. And a lot of times men are like, well, I just put my hand there to see how they react. And if they don't pull away, then I think that to me thinks that they want it. And then sometimes the women are like, oh, well, he's into kinky sex, and I think that's kind of cool because it seems like that's kind of like the vibe now. And so when we actually break down choking during sex, and I call it choking, even though choking is a bad term for it, because choking is a blockage of the airway because of a foreign object. What they're doing is strangulation and asphyxiation, and it is illegal to do. You cannot consent to anything that's going to cause serious bodily injury. So that's why there's no safe way to choke, because if you do it, even just slight pressure can create a lot of injuries in the neck that may not be visible in the moment. And so we are going to have a situation where someone strangles someone during sex and they're going to call it consensual and they're going to kill them. And it's going to be a huge thing. And so there's not a whole lot of prevention talking about choking during sex, and people are just doing it without realizing how dangerous it is to even put pressure around the neck. And so as a result of it, college students tend to be very vulnerable for a ton of different reasons. They're in a new environment. They're doing things that they normally wouldn't do because they want to make friends and they want to fit in. College is stressful, not only in terms of classes, but, socially, you're on your own. And it's also like you have this unbridled freedom to do whatever you want. And so you can go buck wild and make bad mistakes. And that's why I think everyone should go to college, to make those mistakes and things like that. But what happens is you have people that are going to college that are going to take advantage of others. But then I did Title IX investigations for a year because I hated myself, and I will never do that again. That was the worst. And sometimes you do have these cases where it's just, there's no talking. There's no asking about what they want. And victims are saying like, he just did this without asking. And so it's stuff like where we have to have these conversations. I know religion has to do a lot with it, but like nobody wants to talk about sex. No one wants to talk about consent because it's icky or it's scary or blah, blah, blah. And as a result, this red zone is going to continue because people are coming. It's usually the beginning of the fall semester is the red zone, but it's usually the beginning of most semesters because people are coming back. You're going to parties, you're catching up with your buddies and all that stuff like that. And things get out of hand and people get so intoxicated that they're going to take advantage of others, whether that is malicious or they are just not even going to worry about consent and just try to get whatever they want. And so it is a huge aspect of it, but a lot of it has to do underdeveloped brains, new environments, new pressures. It's all kind of a cluster of high-risk behaviors that if someone is, engaging a lot more of these high-risk behaviors more frequently throughout the week, that's going to increase the risk of not only committing crime, but also becoming a victim of crime as well.
And as an investigator, I have investigated probably 10, 15 actual murders where the perpetrator was saying it was consensual, but I just tightened my hand too hard. And next thing I know, she's dead or he's dead.
Well, and what's crazy, it actually takes 5 minutes of continuous pressure to actually kill someone via asphyxiation.
Exactly.
So that's bullshit.
Exactly.
And if you think about it, like 5 minutes of strenuous activity of squeezing someone is very hard to do. So there is 5 minutes of that person thinking about, what am I doing? I should stop doing this and things like that. So it's like, that's why like the rough sex defense is 100% bullshit.
Exactly. And and most of them use the excuse, at least the ones that I investigated, they used the excuse of, well, I was so intoxicated, I didn't really know what was happening.
I was like, that speaks to larger issues. And then I was like, oh, so we should just let you free. So like, and you say, oh, I'm not going to drink again. I don't trust you enough to do that. And if you like killed someone, it's wild.
Miranda and Ashley, whenever someone that starts giving you flowers and really love bombing you, kind of look at it and go, okay.
And make sure they're nice flowers. Because if someone's going to love bomb you, like get yours,
Exactly.
Yeah. Don't be afraid
right?
to tell them expensive flowers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What's
Sure.
the point?
And you're like, and the best thing is like, what would really make me feel special if you sign this note that I can keep everything after we break up? Like that's
perfect.
What other questions do you have, Miranda and Ashley, before we wrap this up?
I think you covered most of them.
My only outstanding question is just it says when I was doing my little research, it was saying that during the pandemic and over the years, IPV has slowly decreased by very small percentage, but the intensity of it has increased. So what does that mean?
After the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, we actually saw a 50 to 60% decrease in intimate partner homicides, because a lot of what that did was provided a lot of funding to train law enforcement and prosecutors to have trauma-informed approaches and to hold perpetrators accountable. So that definitely helped. But what we are seeing, especially in Colorado, is that actually intimate partner homicides are actually increasing while violent crime in general is decreasing. So at this point, it's really hard to look at crime trends unless we have multiple years to compare. And so really we are at a new BC. So things before COVID are completely different after COVID and things like that. So with that, I think a lot of society being crazy right now, a huge unemployment, there's a lot of additional stressors after the pandemic that I think is creating a lot of strain in relationships that is leading to that, even though we are getting a lot better about homicide prevention with screenings and things like that. But a lot of that is if an agency is going to adopt it in terms of that prevention. And some agencies just they say they take domestic violence seriously, but it's not a priority kind of thing. Drugs and gangs can be much more of a priority, even though domestic violence is also involved in drugs and gangs as well. So it's not something that is a very unique crime. It's involved in a lot of the issues that officers deal with. But to a lot of officers, they hate those calls. They don't want to deal with them, and I don't blame them. But it is a significant chunk of a lot of what officers deal with. And so, the more that we can be proactive, not only from like criminal justice practitioners, but also as like friends and family members to become well-versed in healthy relationships and to feel comfortable enough with the people that we love to be like, girl, he's sending you flowers every day, and not only one of them are roses. Diligent. So like, you need friends and families to look out for you and to pay attention to you and realize sometimes that the abuse, and it's hard, 'cause that's why they call it blinded by love. Like, everyone's telling you this is a bad person, like you shouldn't be with them, but like, they're like, well, they're not like that with me. And it's like, and I get that, but that's because they're love bombing you. And it's, and we're seeing this and we're concerned for your safety. And so sometimes it's just victims need an outside person to help them kind of vent and realize that this isn't okay. And if you want to stay in this relationship, we should talk about some safety planning aspects and, identifying some key people that can be kind of on alert if anything happens and stuff like that. Like developing a game plan.
Be your safety valve, so to speak.
Yeah.
Exactly. We appreciate you being here on the episode. You gave some great information.
I feel like my brain's going to explode with all this new information, but in a great way, If it explodes, it'll share the other information. So
that's what you get for inviting me on. I will talk to your ear for hours. I get calls from reporters all the time. They think that they're going to have a 15-minute conversation, and then like 3 hours later, they're like, I literally have to get off the phone. I'm so sorry. And I open up a fire hydrant because I was like, there's so much good information out there that everyone needs to know this. And so it's just, I appreciate any opportunity to talk about this because I think it's something I'm very passionate about this. And I like that I am a data nerd so that I can take complex information and make it digestible for the average person and everyday people. Because what I've realized is that like officers may hate these calls, but they care about this job. They care about being a police officer and they want to help. But sometimes we get frustrated at them for not knowing what they should know, but they're not getting access to that information. So the more that we can build the capacity of officers to deal with these cases and also ensure that it doesn't impact them, because we could talk a whole other time about vicarious trauma and burnout in a lot of these cases, because that's another area of research that I do with child abuse investigators. It's a real thing. This work is really hard and it can impact us. And so we have to be strong going into the work and strong maintaining it. But we also need to be working in agencies that care about our health as well and care about these types of crimes and giving us the resources to the best of their ability to help us do it. Because what's going to make people leave this is not having enough resources to do the job, which is pretty much policing in general.
Right.
We want to thank Dr. Brady for being a guest on the show today and providing his exceptional knowledge about IPV.
Criminology Chats is brought to you by the Chicago School. For more information about the institution, please visit www.thechicagoschool.edu. That's www.thechicagoschool.edu. I would like to extend my gratitude to the students who always participate in these episodes. We want to hear from our listeners, so please email us at criminologychatspodcast@gmail.com. That's CRIMINOLOGYCSPODCAST@gmail.com. And also please check out our YouTube channel at https://www.youtube.com/@Criminology Chats Podcast. This podcast is produced and edited by A.M. Peters with additional post-production services provided by Audio Photo Synthesis. I'm JR Rainbolt, and I eagerly anticipate you listening to our next episode. Be safe out there.
The views and perspectives shared in these recordings are intended solely for informational purposes and do not reflect the official stance or policies of the speakers of the Chicago School. Any commercial products and manufacturers mentioned are included for informational reasons only and do not imply endorsement or approval by the speakers of the Chicago School.